Hi everyone. A few of my friends sent me this video and I started watching it and noticed that I'm in it and decided to pause it and come back and react to it while I watch it. Basically, it's some commies saying that they are going to dispel the rumors, debunking Gusano lies about Cuba. This must be very interesting. A whole bunch of non-Cubans are going to tell us about Cuba. So, here it goes.
I think what people don't understand is that the problem in Cuba stems from the fact that people can't do anything for themselves. How do you feed yourself? How do you make money? You're only allowed to make money if the government says it's okay.
I smell bullshit.
Mira que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será para mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, viva la revolución.
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
What I want to do, I want to play a clip. This is from our favorite channel, guys, Reason TV, libertarian right-wing imperialist propaganda. Why a dictatorship could crumble. Young Cubans have not been brainwashed. Some Gusana from Florida who's helping, the Patria y Vida, fatherland and life movement in Cuba. You guys remember that PSYOP like a year or two ago, using black and brown bodies to promote imperialism. So I'm going to play this clip, and we'll get some reaction from Chris about just the psyops and all of the imperialist propaganda that they're using, because it's very strong. Unfortunately, a lot of people are falling for it.
A massive protest movement broke out in Cuba in July of 2021. Food, medicine, and electricity shortages, exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, were pushing an already desperate, oppressed, and impoverished nation to the brink of a rebellion. Demonstrators used the internet, which has only been legally available in the country since 2018, to coordinate action in large and small cities across the island.
Me sentí libre. Nunca en mi vida había vivido algo tan espectacular y maravilloso.
So the Cuban government quickly arrested hundreds of protesters and shut down the internet. Video of a YouTuber being pulled out of her room in the middle of a Spanish news broadcast went viral.
La van a detener en directo.
Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel appeared on state TV to call for the violent suppression of the protests against counter-revolutionaries.
A todos los revolucionarios del país, a todos los comunistas, a que salgan a las calles en cualquiera de los lugares donde se vayan a producir estas provocaciones. Hoy, desde ahora y en todos estos días.
In Miami, members of the sizable Cuban-American population plan to load their own fishing boats with supplies to make the 90-mile journey to the island themselves, but were deterred by the U.S. Coast Guard. They set off fireworks in international waters off the coast of Cuba instead.
I think what people don't understand is that the problem in Cuba stems from the fact that people can't do anything for themselves. How do you feed yourself? How do you make money? You're only allowed to make money if the government says it's okay. And that's how the government throttles people. They'll throw you in jail if you decide to try and feed your family on your own.
Martha Bueno is a Cuban-American activist who started the group People for Cuba following the protests. They assemble packages of dry foods and medical supplies and then pay people $35 a pound to smuggle them onto the island. They've shipped more than 800 pounds so far, but she says it's become more difficult in recent months as the Cuban government has cracked down on smuggled supplies.
The big reason that we have to smuggle it into Cuba is because if I send it legitimately through the Cuban government, if I raise thousands of dollars and send a container ship of medicine to Cuba, the Cuban government will take that and then sell it in the stores. And I wanted it to be humanitarian aid. People who needed it to be able to receive it without paying. And I especially won't help the Cuban government. I refuse to fundraise, pay for, and then give it to them so that they can sell it in the stores. I'm not that kind of girl.
She certainly isn't. In one of her most popular tweets, Bueno, an outspoken libertarian, wrote, "When my father was 21, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for attempting to leave his country, Cuba. A year into his sentence, my fearless mother broke him out of jail. You might want to trade your freedom for safety, but I sure as hell don't." How did hearing these family stories growing up affect your political outlook and your view of current day events in Cuba?
How can it not? How can it not affect my political views when I can contrast? I can get on an airplane here and leave and go anywhere, which I do love to travel. And every time I get on an airplane, I think about that, how that simple action of trying to leave your country landed my father with a 6-year sentence. I mean, everything in my life, I can draw a parallel to what's happening in Cuba. Cuba wasn't always that way. Political decisions have led to people not having those freedoms. So of course I'm going to defend the freedoms we have. I feel like there's no other way.
With the Cuban government, they are no government. They are no government. They are a mob.
Danny Lugo came to America from Cuba 22 years ago and manages logistics for Bueno's operation. He says that even though the communist dictatorship has survived for 63 years, the courage and independence of Cuba's youth give him hope that change is finally coming.
I think there is a new generation of Cubans or young Cubans that have not been brainwashed. So that's our hope, and we want to help that generation to win the freedom.
Shout out to Salifu Romero. You love to trigger me. I gotta do it. I hate to do that. We gotta hear the Gusanos. It's fucking crazy. It's fucking
They don't have no
crazy.
shame though. Like they're really
No shame.
grown men and women telling these big lies with no shame.
Guantanamera says hard sucking Gusanos. Even Yeonmi Park. Shout out to Workers Reading Room, by the way, great channel. Even Yeonmi Park is more convincing than her. Smuggle because of U.S. sanctions. Shout out to Big Teal. Love Big Teal. How are these people from more free Cuba don't have the same critique of the U.S.? Exactly. Chris, your thoughts, having just come back from Cuba?
I don't know where to start with that. I echo Salifu's sentiment. Wow, you just love to trigger me.
I love triggering you guys. I gotta do it.
It's crazy because one of the things when it's like, oh, the Cuban government is not a government, they're a mob. It's like, first of all, the Cuban government is a lot more grassroots oriented than like what could ever exist here. I mean, the level of engagement with people, again, throughout the country, to the fact where they can have like referendums on the Constitution, where they can have referendums on designing a new family code. It's just a higher level of like organization and like popular, participation in all levels of government than what could ever exist in a liberal system like the United States. Or again, like I said, in a liberal system like Chile, which is kind of designed by the United States. But it was interesting that he said like, oh, it's the mob, but it's like, the actual mob, the actual mafia that the U.S. had, like in Cuba, they got kicked out in 1959. So maybe his parents are descended from that, and they're, just still a little salty about that. But it's interesting though that question though of like political repression and political prisoners, because of the fact that there are political prisoners in the United States, who were a part of anti-colonialist movements, who were actually fighting for the liberation of the masses of the people, and who have received support on numerous occasions from Cuba and the Cuban people, to the point where even like Cuban political prisoners, like members of the Cuban Five, who were held here in the United States, they've been in solidarity with people like Sundiata Acoli, like Mumia Abu-Jamal, like Leonard Peltier. Cuba has always, the Federation of Cuban Women, the Cuban government, they've always come out and supported Mumia, who is still in prison, since the 80s, and is a Black Panther veteran. And, we find that many of the people who are political prisoners are those who are veterans of the Black Panther Party, And also veterans of movements internationally. You know, there are Colombian FARC members in prisons in the United States. There are Palestinian political prisoners. There are political prisoners that the United States holds on illegally occupied land in Guantanamo. And so all this stuff that, you know, people like to, you know, disregard, like the CIA, disregard imperialism and think that, oh, you're just overreacting. It's like you can see it, you know, physically. You know, in Cuba, the people who live, you know, next to the military base can see imperialism right there. You know, it's not a game. It's not imagined. And so these folks who, you know, are part of this, oh, like SOS Cuba or Patria y Vida, you know, I mean, they're literally they're literally front groups for the CIA, and it's not even like it's not that's not hyperbole. Like there's actual connection, like there's documents to like State Department like connections with that. And you know, again, we have to go back to you know, the purpose of the blockade and the implementation of the U.S. blockade on Cuba. The fact that they intimidate so many businessmen around the world, you know, or business people around the world to not do business with Cuba. You know, which also goes to the importance of countries like China and Russia doing business with Cuba. You know, the bus that we were on, the Venceremos Brigade, our bus was a Chinese-made bus. So, I mean, but the purpose of the blockade is literally word for word to create enough, you know, discontent in Cuba, to create enough destabilization so that the Cuban people will rise up against their government because the government is too popular among the masses of people. So, I did not necessarily get the impression that Cubans are willing to get rid of their government en masse anytime soon. You know, they recognize their lives and their country and their responsibility to each other as a part of a long-term anti-colonial struggle that they are still in a process of, you know, figuring out, and that they're making great advancements in. And for it to just be sidelined by these bullshit conversations with, like, you know, these CIA ops, it's like, you know, that is the American voice, and that's what people, unfortunately, from the global South, a lot of times, those are the folks that come to the U.S. You know, they come to their little trash can so they can be trash with the rest of the U.S. You know, and oppress colonized people here. So,
yeah, most definitely. And I always remind people that the class nature of a Cuban quote unquote refugee and exile is so different from the class nature of Haitian migrants or Honduran migrants or Mexican, you know, people who are fleeing capitalist right wing countries that are affected and impacted by imperialism. And I think that's so important to remember, because I think a lot of times people lump in Latinos within one group and they're just like, oh, the Cuban Gusano Miami that has like 5 rentals and makes money from usury and banking, and they're connected to the CIA. They're completely different from a Mexican or a Haitian worker who's cleaning dishes, washing dishes in the back of a restaurant. So I think that's really, really important and crucial to mention.
And they're still making money off of Cuba. The only ones who make, you know, who make the most money off of like the private businesses that were open in Cuba are these same Gusanos who are able to have connections to the island, you know, and able to, you know, somewhat, you know, maybe have a family rent out a house or something, or, you know, run their business for them. You know, it's still just, it's a bunch of hypocritical shit. You know, the only reason why the people of Cuba are, you know, survive is because the state takes on the debt of the people. You know, the state takes on, you know, the responsibility for the economic welfare of the people. You know, it's not up to private businesses, which is why they have a longer life expectancy than us, which is why it doesn't cost anything to go to school, you know, which is why, you know, housing is more accessible there, you know, which is why a whole list of conditions, you know, again, for a country that, you know, with conditions that are comparable to the rest of the global South, you know, it stands head and shoulders in terms of human rights above the country that steals the most from any other country, which is the one that we live in here.
All right. So, wow, what a bunch of shit. So, first of all, it's not a blockade, it's an embargo. There's no blockade. A blockade would imply that ships are surrounding Cuba, and then that would mean that nothing can get in or out of Cuba. That's a blockade. There's an embargo. They mentioned that the embargo was to make Cuba suffer and to rise against its government. That's not the case either. The embargo was implemented after 1959, after Fidel Castro expropriated over $6 billion in 1959 money from Americans. They took businesses, they took land, they took homes, they took things from Americans, and they added it up, and it's about $6 billion of then money, probably closer to 20 billion now. So the United States put an embargo, and what that means is that there are 11 Cuban regime businesses that we can't do business with, particularly. They're all military businesses of Cuba. And then there's also the fact that the United States can't lend Cuba money. And there's a reason for that. That is because they owe us money. So until they pay it back, we can't lend them anymore because they don't pay their debts. And they just recently were sued in court in London because they hadn't paid back a debt from the 1970s, 1980s that was so old. The currency that they were that they didn't pay back was like a currency that no longer exists. It was the Dutch mark. So that's how old their debts are, and they don't pay it back. As far as me being a gusana, you know what? I'm so sick and tired of listening to it. I've already said that I am proud to be gusana, which means it's a derogatory term meaning a worm, and that was for people who left Cuba because they didn't want to stay with the revolution and be a communist. Yeah, I'm not a gusana. I have turned into a capitalist butterfly. You can keep your fucking gusanos anywhere you want. And then, you know, there's all this stuff about being connected to the CIA. You know, the CIA owes me a lot of checks then, because I sure as fuck haven't gotten any because I'm not connected to the CIA or the FBI or any other government organization. I've never belonged to the US government organization, and I never will. So, that's a lot of slander for one little clip. And then I like how the guy that was talking, he's not actually Cuban. He doesn't probably even speak any Spanish. Who is he? He went on a tour, which they show you the pretty parts. There's a literal communist tour that they take you around to the good hospital for the tourists, and they take you to the good places, and there's a certain amount of streets. I mean, come on. I've gone to Tijuana in Mexico, and the bus company that took us there were like, don't move from this street to this street because anything outside of that is dangerous. Same thing they do everywhere else. It's like, don't go here. And also in Cuba, you're kind of escorted everywhere. It's not like you're just going to be going out alone when you go on these tours. These people have no way of interacting with the actual community and discussing. And then as far as the only people that were making money in Cuba were Americans here that are connected there, oh my God. What part of fucking stupidity is this? Seriously. What else did he say that was pretty much everything he said was just utter and complete bullshit. A whole bunch of gringos that don't know anything are telling Cubans what it's really like. Like Daniel Lugo, it's not that his parents or anything. Daniel Lugo, in that video, the guy with the white hair, he had to escape. His family's still there. He grew up in Cuba, as you can tell by his accent. He's not a CIA operative. He's a real guy. And then to be like, we're sending, you know, this medicine because of the embargo, we can't. I want you to know that all medicine and medical equipment, there's no embargo on that. There's no sanction on that. There's no nothing on that. You can literally send as much medicine as you want. And actually during the pandemic, because they were needing so many medications that people like me were sending, the Cuban government actually put out information saying that they were going to remove the import fees for all of those things for their people. The only sanctions there are on medicine are put on by the Cuban government. You can't just import things into Cuba. And then finally, the last point I want to make is about how they have a government that's closer to the people. And yeah, I like how he glossed over the whole, like, yeah, we have political prisoners here. Oh, yeah? Did you go out and protest in the streets? And did they beat the fuck out of you and then put you in jail for 20 years? Because that's what's going on in Cuba. People were literally beaten. Some people were killed. They actually, the video, like, it just doesn't even make sense. The video they watched right before, there was a YouTuber who was taken live, in the middle of a live, The state police came into her home and ripped her out of her home for being against the government. And then he has the balls to be like, well, the FARC and from all these other places are political prisoners. I'm sorry, the FARC is literally Colombia's cartel, underground militia that was the one that was moving drugs through Latin America. That's a little bit differently. I can't imagine the level of stupidity to think that a person, also there were 50 children under the age of 18 that were taken as political prisoners in Cuba. The imagination of somebody to be like, what's the same as somebody just going out and speaking their mind on the street and saying, I don't want this for my country, is the FARC, a terrorist organization that literally moves drugs and traffics humans. Oh yeah, direct parallel, direct. And then the people in Cuba have more control. The government is closer to the people and you can vote on amendments. There is one political party and one ideology allowed in Cuba, and that is of the PCC, or el Partido Comunista Cubano. Who are those? They're the Communist Party of Cuba. You belong to the Communist Party, or you don't do anything in Cuba. You don't get to vote. You don't get to choose what you're voting on. You don't get to vote. It's a sham, because it's a mafia that controls Cuba. It's a mob, like Daniel said. The people in charge have been in charge for 64 years. It's like a monarchy. But in this case, it's not pretty kings and queens that and we don't get to say, oh, look at the royal family, aren't they distinguished? No. These are people who robbed the country from the Cubans, not from some bougie oligarchy. No. Regular ass Cubans that were working the fields one day and the next day it was just taken from them. Like if you're in your home, you commies, you're sitting at home and then they just take your shit. Well, that's kind of what happened to people, except they weren't communists. So yeah, Cubans don't have any political ability in Cuba, and they don't have a voice, and they can't say that their government is wrong, and they can't go against their government. It saddens me to see this amount of stupidity on the internet, but it angers me too. I want to say it angers me more than it bothers me, but it both. So if you see anything else, commie out there, and you want me to react to it, send it my way. But definitely, we need to stop with allowing this type of stuff to go out there without getting called on. This is bullshit. These people are literally making excuses for a regime that will brutalize, murder, repress. People in Cuba don't eat really well at all. They don't have electricity most of the time. They don't have the things that you have here in America. If that's being oppressed, I will gladly send you to Cuba so you can go live in your happiness while you here, with all these luxuries like air conditioning and lights and electricity that never goes out and food in my plate. If that is oppression, man, I don't know. You really need to go live in Cuba.